You're more likely to die taking a selfie than from a shark attack. Let that sink in. Over 379 people worldwide have died trying to capture the perfect photo. Most of them were under 30, and most of them thought they had control. A teenage boy in Houston posed with a gun he believed wasn't loaded. An influencer in Hong Kong edged closer to a waterfall she had posed beside many times before. A Polish couple stood on the edge of Europe's most dramatic cliff while their children watched. And 3 American teens stepped onto train tracks, focused on the camera, not the second train. But these aren't urban legends. These are real people and real final moments. And some of their last images are still circulating online today. In this video, we're breaking down some of the most horrifying selfie deaths ever recorded. The photos, the seconds before impact, and the split-second decisions that changed everything. Because sometimes the last picture you post is the last picture you ever take. Would you ever walk out onto a train bridge at night, stand a few steps from a live power line, and trust that nothing bad will happen just for one selfie? Most of us say no without even thinking, but that's exactly the kind of risk she took. She was 17. Her name was Zenia Ignatieva, an amateur photographer from St. Petersburg who loved dramatic shots, and, like a lot of teenagers in 2014, had started chasing bolder angles for selfies so her photos wouldn't disappear in the scroll of her friends' feeds. And on that April night, she convinced a friend to go out with her to a railway bridge in the Krasnogvardaysky district because the tracks disappearing into the distance at night felt like the perfect backdrop. And that's how a normal night on a railway bridge turned into the last photo of her life. Her friend, a girl named Oksana according to reports, stayed on the ground near the embankment while Zenia began to climb, and police later told the family that she wanted to take the selfie at night to give it the most dramatic effect, with the railway line as a backdrop, which sounds like a line straight out of a creative teenager's head, because she wasn't thinking about voltage, clearance distances, or the fact that those quiet tracks carried enough energy to kill her in seconds. So she climbed onto the bridge structure, and you can imagine the view she saw: darkness, the rails stretching away under her, the faint lights of the district in the distance, and somewhere in that moment she lifted the phone, maybe shifted her weight to find the right angle, and the decision that should have been nothing more than a pose turned into the first step of a chain she couldn't stop. Most accounts agree on what happened next, even if they can't tell us the exact second it went wrong. On the bridge, as she got into position for the shot, Zenia lost her balance, and in the instant that her body realized she was falling, she did what anyone would do without thinking. She reached out to grab something solid so she could pull herself back up. However, the something her hand found wasn't a railing or a beam. It was a high-voltage power cable running beneath the bridge, and when her fingers closed around it, about 1,500 volts tore through her body before she ever hit the ground. She was electrocuted as she slipped, and then fell roughly 30 feet from the bridge to the concrete below. And police later told her grandmother that it was possible she lived for a short time after the fall, but by the time anyone reached her, there was nothing they could do. Down below, her friend froze. Emergency services were only alerted because someone in the area phoned police to say children were playing on the bridge. And when responders arrived, they didn't find a group of thrill-seekers with a camera. They found Zenia's body on the ground and Oksana nearby, paralyzed with shock, unable to process how fast a quick photo idea had turned into a scene covered in blue lights. On paper, the investigation into her death was straightforward. The authorities treated it as an accidental electrocution and fall on railway property, and there was no suggestion of foul play, no hunt for a saboteur, no shadowy figure on the bridge, just an unofficially off-limits structure, a live cable, and a teenager who had trespassed into a space designed for trains and engineers, not for selfies. There is no public transcript of long interrogations, no courtroom drama to pore over, and no evidence that the railway company or individual officials were charged criminally for what happened that night. Instead, her case appears inside a pattern that police, journalists and safety experts were only just starting to name: the rise of death by selfie, where access to a camera and a social media account gives ordinary people a reason to climb structures and enter danger zones that would otherwise never tempt them. And as her face circulated, other cases began to echo the same pattern. So the story of a single teenager on a bridge in St. Petersburg started to feel less like a freak event and more like the first wave of something bigger. Within a year, headlines appeared about 2 15-year-old girls in Taganrog who climbed onto the roof of a freight train to take a selfie and were electrocuted by overhead wires. And not long after that, Another 14-year-old girl near Moscow died after going onto a cargo train roof with friends to make a flashy selfie. So investigators, journalists and psychologists began talking in more explicit terms about a trend. Young people trespassing onto railway infrastructure specifically to capture photos that felt daring enough to stand out. At the same time, outside Russia, stories popped up of an 18-year-old in Romania who climbed onto a parked train and was killed instantly when an arc of electricity jumped from a high-voltage cable, and when you put those cases next to Xenia's, the pattern is hard to ignore. Authorities eventually launched campaigns warning people not to take extreme selfies on bridges, rooftops, and railways, and they produced posters and public safety messages explaining, sometimes bluntly, that no number of likes is worth a fall from a bridge or a shock from a live cable. But you can feel in those campaigns that they're reacting to stories like Xenia's, because her death showed what happens when the thrill of the photo and the normal teenage urge to impress collide with infrastructure that doesn't forgive mistakes. But she wasn't the only one who treated a deadly drop like a backdrop. If Xenia's story unfolded on a cold railway bridge in Russia, Sophia's played out in warm sunlight on the edge of a Hong Kong waterfall. But before we continue, kindly like this video and subscribe for more videos like this, and let us know where you are watching. Would you ever step right up to the edge of a waterfall, balance on the rock with a 5-meter drop below you, and trust that you'll be fine, just so the photo looks a little more impressive on Instagram? That's exactly what 32-year-old Sophia Chung did, and until the very last afternoon of her life, it made perfect sense to her, because this wasn't a one-off stunt for her, it was her routine. She was a Hong Kong-based influencer and outdoor lover, posting under the handle at hike.sophie, and her feed was full of hikes, cliff edges and shots where she dangled her legs over drops or stood on narrow ledges with the city or the sea behind her. So her followers expected that mix of danger and beauty, and she knew that a flat, ordinary selfie just didn't get the same reaction. The last thing she posted before that hike almost felt like a promise. On July 9th, she shared a beach-style photo and wrote, "Brighter days are on the horizon. They're known as Saturday and Sunday." And you can picture the mindset behind that line. Weekend coming up, more adventures, more content, more memories. So when she woke up on Saturday, July 10th, and met up with 3 friends for a hike, it felt like the start of exactly what she'd just captioned. They set out around 11 in the morning toward Hapak Lai, a wetland and coastal area in Hong Kong's new territories that hikers love for its sunsets, mudflats, and the rocky streams that cut down from the hills, and Sophia had been there before, so this wasn't some unknown jungle. The 4 friends headed to the Singdai stream area near Pineapple Mountain, where the water flows over rocks into clear pools, and they spent the day like thousands of other hikers do, walking, talking, taking photos, so nothing about the timeline felt unusual, until late afternoon rolled around and the light started to get softer, because if you're someone who lives half in real life and half through your camera, you know that's when the best shots happen. By around 5 in the evening, Sophia moved toward the edge of a small waterfall above a pool that was about 5 meters deep, and the setup would have looked familiar to anyone who followed her. The drop below, the water, the frame of rock around her, and the chance to turn a hike into a dramatic image. So she edged closer, wanting that angle where you can see both her and the void beneath her feet. She'd done variations of this many times, perched on a cliff, leaning over a ledge, so her body probably treated it as normal, but rock surfaces near waterfalls are rarely as solid as they look, and the slightest patch of slick moss or a misjudged shift in weight can act like a trapdoor. One moment she was posing for a photo on the edge, and then, in a heartbeat, she lost her footing. Her balance went, and there was nothing to grab that could hold her, so she slipped and plunged roughly 16 feet down into the pool below. The water might look inviting in photos, but a sudden fall from that height into a deep pool can knock the air out of you, disorient you, and keep you from getting your bearings. And this wasn't a controlled jump where you brace yourself. It was a fall she didn't plan for, so her friends suddenly went from watching someone pose for Instagram to watching her disappear into the water below. They reacted the way terrified friends do. There's that moment of shock, then shouting, then scrambling, and almost immediately they pulled out their phones. But this time, it wasn't for photos, it was to call emergency services and try to get rescuers there before whatever damage had been done became permanent. Rescue teams responded and made their way to the scene, and because of the terrain, they didn't just walk her out. Sophia was airlifted by helicopter to Pamela Yude Nethasol Eastern Hospital in Chai Wan, which tells you how serious her condition was by the time they reached her. Doctors did what they could, but by the time she arrived she was in critical condition, and she was pronounced dead at the hospital, turning a casual weekend hike into a case file that would be summarised in just a few lines. Slipped while taking photos at the edge of a waterfall, fell into a 5-metre deep pool, did not survive. Hapag Lai remains a popular area, but after her death, safety commentators and local media leaned into the reminder that even familiar beauty spots can be extremely dangerous the moment you treat the edge like a prop instead of a boundary. Online, the grief and shock showed up in the same place she had built her persona, on her Instagram page. Friends and followers filled her last post with comments like, "I'm going to miss your chat every day. I love you always. Rest in peace, my pretty Sophie." And, "I can't believe last week I still chatted with you." And those messages pull you out of the headlines and back into the reality that this wasn't just an influencer. It was someone people talk to every day, someone who had turned her love of hiking and water and cliffs into a kind of identity. Some coverage even pointed out the painful irony of that last caption about brighter days and weekends, because the day she was looking forward to turned out to be the one she never walked away from. Her fall slotted into a wider pattern that safety researchers had already started mapping out. Reports linked her to cases like the French tourist in Thailand, who fell from a waterfall while taking a selfie, and to dozens of other incidents where tourists and content creators stepped past barriers or stood on slick rocks for photos, so her story became part of that global warning. The more we normalize epic edge-of-cliff photos in our feeds, the easier it is to forget that a scene which looks controlled and cinematic on screen is often one mistake away from a rescue helicopter in an emergency room. Sophia's fall happened with friends just a few meters away, but the next story unfolds in front of the only people who mattered even more. 2 young children watching their parents step past a safety rail for one perfect family photo. Would you ever ask your kids to stand back and just press the button while you step a little closer to the edge because the view looks better without the safety rail in the shot? That's exactly what this Polish couple did at Cabo da Roca, and on paper it sounded like the most normal thing in the world. A family day trip to one of Portugal's most famous viewpoints, a husband and wife in their 30s who had been living in the country for several years, driving out with their 5- and 6-year-old children to see the place locals call the edge of the world. The cliffs there are spectacular and brutal at the same time. Sheer drops of 80 to 140 meters straight down into the Atlantic, strong winds and waves smashing the rocks so hard you can hear them from the top. So of course there are fences and warning signs, and of course, like so many tourists, they weren't content to let those fences show up in their photos. So at some point that Saturday evening in August 2014, after they'd walked up to the monument and read that this was the westernmost point of mainland Europe, they drifted away from the safe viewing platform and toward the open rock. Reports from Portuguese authorities later said they crossed the safety barrier at the top in order to get closer to the cliff edge, and witnesses described them edging out so that the ocean would fill the background because a shot taken a couple of meters back felt ordinary, but a shot taken right at the drop looked like a once-in-a-lifetime picture. Their children stayed behind the barrier at first, and then moved up closer to where they could see, because the plan, according to later accounts, was simple. Mum and Dad would pose near the edge, and the kids, or a camera on a timer, would capture the moment. You can imagine the instructions: stand there, wait, we'll just step back a bit, don't move yet. And you can imagine the way a parent's brain lies to them in those moments, because they know it's dangerous in theory, but they tell themselves, we'll be careful, we'll only be there for a second, and that's all it takes. Fire Officer Bruno Tomas would later tell reporters that when it happened, the couple were next to the cliff edge with their children, and police and Polish radio both emphasised that they would have had to cross the safety barrier to reach that spot, so they weren't in some freak zone where nobody could have predicted the risk. They were exactly where the signs and railings had tried to stop them from going. Then, in the space of one misjudged step, the whole scene flipped. Both of them slipped and went over the edge together, dropping hundreds of feet toward the Atlantic while their children watched, and the sound of their parents' voices was replaced by the wind and the distance between the top of the cliff and the rocks below. A Spanish couple who happened to be visiting the same viewpoint saw the fall and immediately ran to the children, pulling them away from the barrier and away from the spot where their parents had vanished. Because in that first stunned minute, kids don't always understand that the danger isn't over, and they could easily have moved closer to look. The Spanish tourist called emergency services, and soon maritime police, firefighters and rescue teams were converging on Cabo da Roca. But getting down to the base of those cliffs with high tide and strong waves is not like walking down a staircase. It's slow, dangerous work, and conditions forced rescuers to give up attempts to recover the bodies that Saturday and wait for better weather and lower tides. While adults in uniforms were out on the rocks and in boats planning how to bring two bodies back up, the children were taken into the care of Polish diplomats in Lisbon and seen by psychologists, because you don't just sit two kids aged 5 and 6 in a waiting room after they've watched their parents vanish over a cliff. Polish officials contacted relatives back home, and family members prepared to travel to Portugal to pick up the children and deal with the bureaucracy and grief that come with a death abroad. And in those first 24 hours, the story existed in two parallel timelines. The physical one, where rescue teams waited for the sea to calm down, and the emotional one, where two kids tried to absorb that the people who brought them to see the end of the world were not coming back. When the weather finally allowed it, rescuers resumed operations the next day and managed to recover both bodies from the rocks and water below, confirming what witnesses and officials already knew. Back in Poland, media reported that the family had been living in Portugal for several years and were happy to call the country home, which made the story even harder for some viewers to swallow, because this wasn't a case of tourists who couldn't read the language on the signs. They understood where they were and they still chose to climb over the line. Would you ever hold a gun to your own neck, look into your phone camera, and trust that it's obviously not loaded, just to make a tougher-looking selfie? That's exactly what 19-year-old Deleon Alonso Smith did in a southwest Houston apartment, and the timing made it even more cruel, because this wasn't some kid with no plans and nothing to lose. He was a young father with 2 small daughters. He was supposed to start community college the very next day, and his family had spent that week talking about how this was going to be the start of something better. On Tuesday, September 1st, 2015, just after lunchtime, Deleon was at an apartment in the Forum Park area with his cousin in a complex on the 9,800 block of Forum Park Drive, and at some point that day the two of them found a gun. They started taking pictures with it, posing together, switching the gun back and forth and snapping selfies to post on social media. So they kept going, and this is where the routine nature of it makes it worse, because the news reports talk about taking several selfies before anything went wrong, which means they got away with the dangerous behavior a few times first, and that false sense of safety is exactly what lures people into thinking they're in control. At some point during that session, the cousin stepped into another room. Different outlets say he went to make food or just walked away briefly, leaving Deleon alone with both the gun and the camera, and in that quiet gap he set up for one more shot. He was in a bedroom, holding the handgun, and investigators later pieced together from where his body fell and from the wound itself that he raised the gun up toward his neck or his throat area while he posed. He believed the gun was unloaded. That detail comes up again and again in the police statements and family interviews, because it's the only explanation that makes sense when you picture someone with a tomorrow, classes, kids, plans, holding a gun to his own throat. Then, in 1 second he couldn't take back, the gun went off. Maybe he pulled the trigger deliberately as part of the pose, thinking nothing would happen. Or maybe his finger brushed it without him really noticing, but either way the weapon fired and the bullet tore into his neck. In the next room, his cousin heard the gunshot and rushed back in to find Deleon on the floor of the bedroom, bleeding and unresponsive, and suddenly the mood in that apartment flipped from "this is funny, take another one" to chaos, shouting, panicked calls to 911, and the realization that you can't rewind a mistake like that. Paramedics and police arrived and did what they could, but Deleon was pronounced dead at the scene, and that the last thing he had done was point a gun at his own throat for a picture. They announced publicly that they were treating it as an accidental shooting, not a suicide, and they said they were still investigating where the gun had come from and who actually owned it. The people who struggled most to process that were his family. His uncle, Eric Douglas, talked to local reporters, and he described it as the worst feeling in my life, saying it felt unreal, like he was numb. His grandmother, Alma Douglas, used a detail that would have stuck in anyone's throat. She said that just the day before, on her birthday, Deleon had come over to wish her happy birthday, and now, less than 24 hours later, she was standing in front of a camera trying to explain how that same grandson was dead because of a selfie with a gun. They talked about his daughters, 1 and 3 years old, and how much he loved them. Detectives questioned the cousin about where they'd found the gun and how long it had been in the apartment, and they tried to trace it back to a legal or illegal owner. But the core message from police was simple. Never assume a gun is unloaded, never point it at something you're not willing to destroy, and absolutely never point it at yourself for a photo, because there is no edit button for a bullet. Would you ever stand on train tracks with your friends, post standing right by a train, haha, this is awesome, and assume that because you can see the train in front of you, you're completely safe? That's exactly what 3 teenagers did one afternoon in October 2011, and from their point of view it probably felt harmless, because they weren't breaking into some abandoned industrial yard or crawling through a tunnel at night. They were just going where a lot of people around them went to take scenic photos, out to the tracks in Spanish Fork Canyon, where the rails curve between the mountains and the view behind you looks like a movie. They were 15-year-old Essa Ricker, her best friend Kelsey Webster, also 15, and Kelsey's 13-year-old sister Savannah, and they headed into the canyon like any trio of high school girls on a weekend, laughing, taking pictures, and treating the railway as a backdrop rather than a live piece of the transport system. If you've ever seen that final selfie, you know how deceptive the moment looked. The girls are smiling, the mountains rise behind them, and a train can be seen passing on the track, so everything about the frame says fun, normal, slightly rebellious afternoon, and nothing about it screams you have seconds to live. The key detail that doesn't show up in the photo is that this section of Spanish Fork Canyon had 2 tracks running side by side, one for trains heading one way, and another for trains heading the other, and the 3 girls were on or between those rails because they wanted the train in their shot, and the sense of being dangerously close without feeling, in their bodies, like they were actually in danger. At some point that day, a westbound Union Pacific train thundered through the canyon, and the noise, the vibration and the rush of air from that long line of freight cars turned their quiet photo spot into an adrenaline-charged stage. So instead of being a signal to get off the tracks, it became part of the experience. Savannah pulled out her phone, typed "standing right by a train, ahaha, this is awesome," and posted it, and that post reads exactly like 1,000 other teenage brag updates. But while they focused on the westbound train they could see, they didn't register that an eastbound train was coming on the other line. 2 heavy trains mean 2 sets of horns, wheels and engine noise, and from ground level the roar of the first can drown out the warning of the second. The conductor in the approaching locomotive later said that he and the engineer saw the 3 girls, the track ahead, and immediately hit the horn and began braking, but they knew, just from experience and distance, that they had only seconds and that the train wasn't going to stop in time. The girls had their backs or their sides to the danger, deafened and distracted by the westbound train they were watching, and by the phone they were using to capture the moment, and there was no sign that they understood that the horn they might have half heard was coming from a completely different direction. Essa and Kelsey were killed almost instantly by the impact. The force of a multi-ton locomotive travelling at speed leaves very little ambiguity, and when emergency services arrived in the canyon, it was obvious that 2 of the 3 girls were beyond help. Somehow, incredibly, Savannah was still alive when first responders reached her, with catastrophic injuries that her body couldn't handle on its own, so they stabilized her as best they could, transported her to hospital, and for a brief period her story diverged from her sisters and her friends. For a few days, her family lived in that suspended state so many families of trauma patients recognize. But 3 days after the collision, with no real prospect of recovery and after agonizing discussions, the family made the decision to remove life support, and Savannah died, turning a single catastrophic impact into a triple loss for the same community. In the aftermath, Spanish Fork and the surrounding towns did what small communities do when they lose teenagers. There were vigils and funerals, classmates wrote messages and signed posters, teachers and parents spoke about how kind or funny or bright the girls had been, and people drove up the canyon and looked at the tracks completely differently than they had the month before. The story spread beyond Utah as well, because the combination of that final selfie and that final Facebook post made it perfect, in a horrible way, for national attention. Suddenly, it wasn't just an abstract warning about don't play on tracks. It was 3 specific faces and 9 specific words frozen in time. Rail safety organizations like Operation Lifesaver began using the case in their educational campaigns, often with the line, "They just wanted some fun selfies of each other," because that's the part adults know will land with kids who don't respond to statistics. Railroad workers dropped into those discussions over and over to point out that from the perspective of the tracks, there is no functional difference. If you're on or between live rails, you're in an active traffic lane for machines that can't swerve and can't stop in time to save you. So let us know what you think about these cases in the comment section. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you in the next video.